This is one of the just cognitive dissonance moments that I've had as an American living in Singapore. I'm brought up to believe in the American system, and Singapore is essentially a benevolent dictatorship that is a family-controlled country along many dimensions. Yet, in certain circumstances for certain types of problems, you look at healthcare, Singapore spends a fraction per capita on healthcare and gets about the same outcomes that the United States gets. So in certain circumstances, the small size is a benefit. Having a different political system where you've got technocrats who are incredibly well-schooled, who are also incredibly well-paid at making decisions, it has some real benefits. And the thing that I just wrestle with is the U.S. system is broken. It needs to be fixed. How that happens, what is the precipitating event to cause that to happen? I have no idea what maybe Thomas, the futurist, knows what the answer is.
Look to the future for us, Thomas, because we...
I don't know, but you know that something just cannot maintain.
In the United States, it's not just one system. I mean, there's a total of right around 90,000 forms of government in the United States. We have city governments and state governments and townships and parishes and federal governments. All of these have one tool that they're using in making new policies. And so to actually radically change that, it seems almost inconceivable without some major catastrophic event. I haven't come up with that yet, but it definitely needs overhaul.
Yeah. I have a bit of a different take on this. I think it's important to recognize that we're always dealing with a tension between two necessary and legitimate drives. There is the power drive, as you called it, individual companies and parties and politicians and interest groups who are trying to get something done and who are pushing for what they want. And that's the source of all innovation and creativity. At the same time, there's genuine interdependence and interconnection. I have used the word, unfamiliar though it may be, as love, the sense of wholeness. And these are permanently in tension. Martin Luther King said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive." Everybody just doing their thing without attention to the whole is reckless and abusive. But he went on to say, "And love without power is sentimental and anemic." Just thinking about the whole and undermining the legitimate expression of individual organizations and people produces stasis. I think, though, the challenge is that even in this permanent tension, we are out of balance. And this is what has gone to the extreme nationally within the United States and internationally as well. That we have primarily strengthened the power drive. And if I put it that way, the question becomes, and this doesn't have an easy answer, it's not how to create a sense of the whole, but how to reveal the wholeness which is there. It may be that in a relatively small and homogeneous country like Denmark, that felt sense of wholeness is easy to see, and it's more difficult in a large and heterogeneous country like the United States. But the point is, the interconnection and interdependence is there, it's just not seen. And of course, the dramatic example of this is climate change, where we are all on one planet. The emissions in China affect rainfall in Kenya. We can pretend we're not, we can pretend we're separate, but that doesn't mean we are. And so what I am focusing my attention on is, through what means can we reveal the wholeness which is already present? And are there different stories we can tell about what's going on that make that interconnection and interdependence visible? That's, I think, the lesson of Denmark, and what's going on now in Europe is a real titanic struggle to try to make work the institutions of wholeness that that were created for those reasons. And it's really difficult. If it's difficult at the European level, we know how much more difficult it is at larger geographic scales.
So what seismic event do we need to create that proper balance of power and love, which I think is a marvelous concept?
Well, one of the surprising things, and I'll just state it as a quandary, I want to again use the climate change example. People have been talking about the global interconnectedness as it relates to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for 50 years, in very clear and compelling ways, and yet it has not been sufficient. We'll see what happens in Doha this week, but it hasn't been sufficient to create the necessary collaborative action. And
usually change comes through crisis,
you know,
and we have, and our title here is Stuckness. 4 years ago, in 2008, we saw some of the governments of the world acting with extraordinary decisiveness and power, even maybe a tiny bit of love, you know, in response to the financial crisis.
Yeah.
You know, a massive, almost terminal crisis caused by banking practices was dealt with bold, risky, even mad actions by governments in a very short space of time because of that sense of peering over a precipice. Whereas climate change, because it is gradual, has never even, I mean, Australia's come closest in the world to a sense of the tangible crisis of climate change, but even here, it's easier to carry on. So my guess would be the answer to many of these questions, I fear, has to be a compelling crisis, but then you get to the definition of leadership as the ability to use the smallest possible crisis for the greatest possible effect. Then we ask the question, will we have leaders who can use, hopefully not disastrous crises, as moments of leverage and change? And the fear is certainly in politics, but I think our business leaders show almost no signs of being capable of that kind of leadership either.
I think the financial example is a good one because there's probably no system that is more obviously globally interdependent and interconnected. And maybe that's, not only was there a crisis, but it was plainly obvious that no institution or nation could resolve it alone. And that's not yet obvious for climate change, or not obvious enough.
I do wonder if this isn't a circumstance where the conditions are right for a movement, where you have a group of young people who they don't quite know what they're protesting against in Occupy Wall Street, so that wasn't quite right. You have a movement now where increasingly young people want to go start companies up, but they're doing things like creating the 97th different derivation of Angry Birds, so that isn't quite right. But if you take some of this energy, I got to laugh, that's good. If you take some of that energy and you combine it in the right way to really create a grassroots movement around a topic like this, coupled with at least a few forward thinkers that are pushing very different approaches, I wonder if the conditions don't create the grounds for something that feels more like a revolution that does not require an externally precipitated crisis. It might still feel like a crisis, but it's more of a grassroots, groundswell-driven crisis than something really bad happens, asteroid hits Earth or whatever.
You might want to check your visa back to Singapore before you go to the airport.
We've got a very interesting party in Europe, the Pirate Party, which has just appeared in the last 2 years, now getting 10-15% of the polling. And essentially, its spirit is almost exactly what you described. It's anti-incumbents of all kinds. And if you ask what stands in the way of change, usually it's systems where the incumbents are too powerful. So in the American political system, incumbents are really hard to get rid of. And in business, the weird thing is we have some sectors like Silicon Valley which are pretty open to newcomers and a lot of churn. But if you look at the share of GDP of the top 1,000 companies, in the last 30 years it's gone up massively. In fact, we've been through a period of the incumbents getting much more powerful in most sectors at the very time, again, where the sort of standard books were saying the opposite. And I think it's that incumbency capture which is our biggest problem in all of these fields. And we need, political parties, but also devices which force openness to newcomers. And in markets, that's competition policy. In politics, it's making it impossible for the funding systems to allow the incumbents to hoard power. And perhaps even in Singapore, it's making sure that someday you get a change of government.